Okay, so now I want to begin a new series and go back and read Rudolf Steiner's commentary on the Gospel according to Matthew. Matthew is generally now considered the second oldest of the four Gospels. Originally, Matthew was considered to be the oldest, which is why it is placed first in the canon. Matthew, then Mark, then Luke, and then John. But now scholars generally agree that Mark is older, and it's evident that Mark is older. It's the shortest, it's the most stripped down and bare, and it tells the story directly. There's no infancy narrative in Mark. As now with Matthew and Luke, we have infancy narratives coming in, and with John, there's also no infancy narrative. Now, in this lecture cycle, Rudolf Steiner starts out by, and this is given in 2 years earlier now from the Mark commentary. This is given now in 1910 in Berna in Switzerland. And Steiner starts off by characterizing how each of the Gospels captures the life of Christ from a different angle. And each one brings out certain qualities that emphasize certain aspects of that particular Gospel. He says, for example, the John Gospel begins with the Logos, the descent of the creative power of this cosmic word, and emphasizes wisdom and understanding, and has a sublime cosmic power to it, where he says then that the Luke Gospel emphasizes Christ's love and his willingness to sacrifice himself for humanity. So it emphasizes more the human nature, as does the Matthew Gospel. Those two emphasize the human nature, whereas Mark and John emphasize the cosmic nature. He says that Mark emphasizes the workings down of the sun god onto the earth, and emphasizes they're two cosmic that emphasizes Christ's spirituality as a being from another world, and the other two emphasize his humanity. And he says that the Matthew Gospel, out of all four of these, emphasizes Christ's humanity the most, which is why it begins with the genealogy now. Instead of starting up like Mark did with the baptism, Matthew decides, and we don't know who Matthew was, actually. He's carrying the name of the tax collector apostle Matthew, but we're pretty sure that he didn't write it. This has been written by an anonymous individuality who we do not know, but who definitely presupposes Mark and also a missing gospel called the Q Gospel, that is a sayings gospel. And he's also pulling from some oral traditions, most likely circulated around Palestine after the event. And this probably dates sometime after the destruction of the temple by the Romans in 70 AD, maybe as late as 80 AD. It probably dates just right around the time of the destruction of the temple, whereas we saw that the Mark Gospel had dated probably from more likely 65 AD, about 5 years before the destruction of the temple. So Matthew emphasizes his human nature and accordingly begins with a genealogy, which is followed then by an infancy narrative, where we have the Annunciation appearing to Joseph now, not to Mary as in the Luke Gospel, but to Joseph, when Mary is all of a sudden mysteriously pregnant, and he has suspicions. He's betrothed to her, so he has suspicions she might have been fucking around on him, so he's getting ready to divorce her. When he has an annunciation in a dream, an angel comes to him and says, no, her conception is from the Holy Spirit. It's pure. Don't divorce her. And then he's also warned again by this angel that Herod the Great has found out about him, and there's going to be a massacre of the innocents and that they need to flee to Egypt. So we have them going into Egypt as a way of reconnecting. Whoever this individual was who wrote this gospel is also much more emphasizing the Jewish nature of the traditions, because he's constantly quoting from texts from the Old Testament. And I think that the Egyptian exile is put in specifically to link the Christ narrative back to Abraham's sojourn in Egypt, followed later by Joseph's sojourn in Egypt, and then, of course, them coming out of Egypt with the Exodus event. So they go to Egypt and they wait it out for a while until Herod is gone, and then they come back. And then before that happens, though, Herod has killed all the firstborn males who are 2 years and younger in the town of Bethlehem. Now note that in the Mark Gospel, and you can tell that it's earlier because things have been added on top of a proto-narrative. I think of the Mark Gospel as a kind of proto-narrative, but subsequent writers have added things. So we don't get any reference to Christ's parents in the Mark Gospel. The Mary who appears at the tomb at the end, the two Marys, Mary Magdalene, and this other mysterious Mary who's referred to as the mother of James and of Salome. And that's all we know about her. There's no connection to Christ there as his mother. This is the first reference we get to his parents. So Matthew creates this story of his parents, Joseph and Mary, and also creates this tradition that he has been born in a little village in the south called Bethlehem, which used to be, with the two kingdoms, we have Israel and Judah. So there's always a north and a south that these writers are keen to keep in mind. And then after the Exodus, after the exile into Egypt, when they come back, they decide not to go near Bethlehem because of Archelaus, who is Herod the Great's son, who is carrying on his tradition. And so they go north to the Galilee, where they raise Christ in Nazareth. Christ is only referred to as Jesus of Nazareth in the Mark Gospel. So all we know is that he's coming from the north in the Mark Gospel and migrates gradually south to Jerusalem, just like the course of the river. So this narrative has added the south in to keep it connected to the Hebrew traditions of Moses and the Exodus and Abraham and all of that kind of stuff, which is why he adds the genealogy. And then he gets to, with chapter 3, he gets to John the Baptist and picks up from Mark and does a lot of changes and emendations. It's about twice as long as the Mark Gospel. It's 28 chapters, whereas Mark was 16, and in terms of length, it's quite a bit longer. So then there's also the fact that these Gospels are associated with the so-called tetramorph of the four astrological signs, the bull, the lion, the eagle in place of the scorpion, since Aquila is the eagle, which is directly above Scorpio, and then finally the water bearer, Aquarius. And Matthew is associated with Aquarius in this tradition, and Aquarius is, of course, the only fully human one of those four signs, which emphasizes the human nature of Christ. Whereas we saw with Mark, Mark was associated with the lion, with Leo then, the workings of a sun god. And basically what Christ is, in the Mark Gospel, is a dragon slayer. He's a solar hero. Instead of slaying dragons, he's casting out demons. So the dragons become demons that he's slaying or casting them out through the performance of his exorcisms. And it's implied that he's a solar hero. Almost all dragon slayers are solar heroes. That's what they are. That's what they do. They represent the powers of light, banishing the powers of the night world, the nighttime world of darkness. And then for John, we have the eagle, which descends like the wings of the Logos, that descends from above with its sublimity. And then with Luke, we have the bull Taurus. And Luke, again, is very earthly, very much has its feet on the ground, like the Taurus bull, which is ruled by Venus and is very close to the ground and is concrete. So these two Gospels, Matthew and Luke, both of whom date from around the same time and draw from similar sources and traditions, emphasize the human nature of Christ. And then Mark, the first, and then last, John, emphasizes his divinity as a cosmic being. And then so Steiner begins by pointing out how we have the three wise men, the three Magi from the East who have come looking for the Christ child. They are from the East, and it's traditional that they are from Persia, that the Magi are from Persia, and that they are, it simply follows that they are Zoroastrians, basically. If they're coming from Persia and they're following the star that leads them to Bethlehem eventually, then the star might be the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter in Pisces in the year 7 BC, which overlaps with the last few years of the reign of Herod the Great. He reigns from 37 BC down to, I think, 4 BC. So it overlaps with the first 3 years of Christ's infancy, where Herod the Great, who was totally paranoid, he had most of his family put to death and eliminated, which is why I think Matthew connects him with the massacre of the innocents. Whether he did do that or not, it's the type of thing that Herod would have done, because he was totally paranoid. He was always thinking that his family and members of his household were conspiring to eliminate him. Remember that Herod had been put in place by the Romans as their ruler, as their puppet king, put in place specifically after they came in. And Pompey cleaned up the mess that had been made in 63 BC when he entered into Palestine. And from there on, the Romans took power, and Herod is put on the throne by them, and he represents their power. But he was totally paranoid. He was always worried someone was going to kill him or poison him and take over his rulership. So he's always having people put to death. Most of his family were put to death as well. He was a very vicious, mean man. So the massacre of the innocents perfectly fits with his temperament. It's the kind of thing Herod the Great would have done. And then so Steiner says, so these three are, they're Zoroastrians, these three wise men from the East, and they are essentially looking for the reincarnation of their great teacher Zarathustra, who is the founder of the Zoroastrian traditions of Persia. And so since Matthew emphasizes this, starts with this genealogy of Christ, which traces him very significantly as the descent from David via Solomon, and through that line, whereas the genealogy in Luke, which goes backwards and starts with Joseph and works backwards through to Nathan, the other son of David, not Solomon. So there's two different genealogies, and so this is going to lead Steiner to the hypothesis that there were two different Jesus children, which is a little weird and I think unnecessary, but it's fun to think about. But anyhow, so since this is a historical emphasis, then Steiner begins by reviewing his sort of history of the Post-Atlantean epochs that led to the creation of Zoroastrianism and the Persians, since this is called for by the genealogy, because it raises the issue of why it's important that for the author of Matthew, why it's important that Christ specifically comes from the traditions through the blood from Abraham, through David and Solomon. Why does he come from this tradition? And then from Steiner's point of view with the reincarnation idea, why is it important that for Zarathustra, when he reincarnates in the body of the Solomon Jesus boy, Jesus of Nazareth, why that's important for him to choose this specific body that has been prepared as a vessel by his descent through the Hebrews, following the purity of the bloodline. And Matthew lists 3 times 14 generations from Abraham to Jesus. So then Steiner wants to get into his history, his mythology, that begins with the sinking of Atlantis, which is just a myth. There never was any Atlantis as far as anyone has ever been able to figure out. It's just a myth, but myths make possible other ways of viewing the world so that you can find out truths that might not otherwise be visible without the myth. So we have the myth of the sinking of Atlantis, he says in this first lecture, and then we have these peoples who are migrating in 2 different streams from west to east, one going across Europe to the areas of the Caspian Sea in the north, and another going over North Africa and going along another stream eventually into India. And then so he has the first post-Atlantean epoch as India, which he gives the ridiculously absurd date of 7000 BC to 5000 BC. But he's always specific to point out, this is not the India of today that I'm talking about. This is an earlier India. And India does go back as far as its Neolithic goes. It does go back to 7000 BC. As far as if we're talking about farmers and goats and mud huts, then yeah. And we know that yoga was practiced before Vedic India got up and running around 1200 BC or 1500 thereabouts, right in there, with the Harappan civilization that was there from 2500 BC when it was at its apogee, although existed for 1,000 years. And we know yoga was practiced there because we find characters in yoga postures on their stamp seals. So we have that civilization there that's before the Vedic India, and it is preceded by at least another 1,000 or 1,500 years or so of development. If you study the history of Harappa, it has a series of stages that goes all the way back to about 7,000 BC. So it's not totally absurd. There were people there were farmers, and who later then do evolve the Harappan civilization with its yogic traditions of reincarnation and karma and so forth. So it's not totally insane, but it's definitely not the Aryan world. But he has this stream that has gone across Africa, though, to create this world in India, whereas later he sees the northern peoples, which are the Indo-Aryans. He calls them Turanians, which is an old term for them, called the Turanians, coming down into both Persia and India in a later phase. So he does take cognizance of that. And then he says that there is, the way the Indians characterized the world was, of course, as an illusion, as Maya. They were very nostalgic for the loss of, there's been a loss of clairvoyant vision since Atlantis, and the Indians were very nostalgic for the spiritual traditions of Atlantis, so they evolved yoga as a means of realizing the world of reality, the Brahman, behind the veil of Maya. And the world correspondingly for them was not really real. It became an illusion, a dream, basically, which is the case. So that's the first post-Atlantean epoch that begins around 7000 BC. And then beginning around 5000 BC, he's got the second Post-Atlantean epoch with the Persians proper, the Iranians, as he calls them here in this chapter proper. And he says that they're different from the peoples in the north who stretch across the north in the area of the Black and Caspian Seas and stretch across the north, the Turanians, which he characterizes as passive and as cultureless. And essentially, the Indo-Aryans were pretty much cultureless. They had no writing, they had no architecture, they lived in tents, they rode horses, and they were entirely nomadic. So it is a different people that, with the myth of Yamshid, he talks about the myth of the Persian hero culture founder Yamshid, who is said to have invented architecture and brick making and agriculture and all these things that begin to lock Persia into place as a rooted civilization. Now, comparing Steiner's model with Oswald Spengler's very late model after he wrote Decline of the West, when he was thinking about these Neolithic cultures, is a bit instructive, I think, as a comparison. Spengler had, as everyone knows, with the Decline of the West, had characterized high civilizations, the kind that began with Egypt and Mesopotamia, as plant-like because they're locked in place. They're rooted to a specific locale, and they stay there for most of their history until they become expansive during their imperial phases. But now he says, he brings in the metaphor of an amoeba, and he characterizes the Turan culture, and he uses the same word that Steiner does to characterize the Indo-Aryans and Indo-Europeans and also the Chinese nomads, whom he calls the early Zhou warrior nomads, in the north as an amoeba, because an amoeba can float around and it can also branch off and create smaller amoebae. So it's not locked in place like these nomadic Turanians that can move across the north, back and forth with their cultureless world. Though Steiner's vision of them Spengler's vision of them disagrees with Steiner in that Steiner characterizes them as passive simply because they didn't bring high civilization into being, as the Persians proper did, the Indo-Aryan Persians who have migrated down into the mountainous area and built civilization under the impetus of King Yamshid. So he characterizes them as passive, which is I'm pretty sure that's dead wrong. And Spengler gets it right that this is a heroic culture in the north par excellence because of all the weapons that they invent. They invent the first truly complex weapon with the chariot, the two-wheeled chariot that requires a two-wheeled chariot, a very meticulously trained warrior who has to know how to shoot with a compound bow from that chariot. Although also the bow and arrow Spengler sees coming from the west, it's not authentic to the Turanian culture, which invents this idea of mano-a-mano combat that we see in the Iliad, for instance, that the Dorians bring with them down when they conquer the Mycenaeans about 1200 BC. And they also have cremation of the dead. They have no reverence for the dead, and they're mobile and based on a hero warrior culture of the now. They invent in the second millennium, along with the chariot, the sword and the axe, which indicates one-on-one combat. So Spengler says the bow and arrow comes from this Western culture that he does indeed call Atlantis, although when he uses Atlantis, the word, he doesn't mean it the way Steiner means it, as the myth of Atlantis and a sinking civilization from which everyone has come. He just uses it to designate that this is an Atlantic civilization because it extends from Ireland along the coasts, and it's entirely coastal as it goes down through North Africa and across, and eventually becomes Egypt. This is a culture of megalith builders. We think of Newgrange, 3500 BC, and Stonehenge, and all of that world. This is a culture of megalith builders who are what he characterizes as hot and mobile. They're on the move. They migrate down, and they're always building in stone. Stone marks the megalithic cultures of the Mediterranean are all along the shores. Although now we have the earliest evidence for megalith builders in Göbekli Tepe, 10,000 BC, which is in Turkey. So there might have been a migration. That comes immediately after the Paleolithic, and it was during the Paleolithic phase of the Atlantis civilization that the bow and arrow was indeed invented. There's lots of Mesolithic art on the cusp between the Paleolithic and the Neolithic that comes out of Spain, the Spanish Levantine style, that shows wars taking place with warriors shooting each other with bows and arrows. And Spengler regards the bow and arrow as not as heroic as the Turanian invention of man-to-man combat with swords and axes, The arrow allows you to shoot at an enemy far away, so it's kind of a cowardly type of warfare as far as Spengler is concerned. But this is the Atlantis culture, worshiping the dead. The dead is very important for them. Most of these megalithic culture monuments are associated with burials, like Kurgan mounds and so forth, and that come along and go all the way down to Egypt, where they are finally apotheosized in all the Egyptian funerary cults. Then the third of Spengler's cultural amoebae, all of which occupy the entirety of the Neolithic, is a culture that he calls Kosh, that extends from India now. This is Neolithic India. It extends from India, Neolithic India, down around the Persian Gulf and to the Red Sea, and East Africa as well. So that's this cultural zone in opposition to the Western zone. And this is a zone it's a priestly zone. It's not hot and mobile like Atlantis. It's tropical and content. So here's the passivity that Steiner was accusing the Turanians of, which they absolutely were not. They were heroes. That was a heroic culture par excellence. No question about that. The priestly culture comes from this Neolithic passivity of this culture that does not worship the dead. What their architecture is based on building temples. They build temples in which they study the stars. This is where they get priestly, astronomical, mathematical determinism that comes out of this Neolithic Kosh culture, and it gives to it its determinism and passivity that later turns up as Indian fatalism. And so Spengler's theory is that where these two amoebae meet and overlap for the first generation of civilization, which we get Egypt and Mesopotamia, with the emphasis in Egypt on the Atlantic culture of creation of monuments for the dead, and the Kosh culture coming in, bringing in the priestly astronomy that is so epitomized by the Babylonians, and I'm sure the Sumerians as well, in which we get the astronomical traditions par excellence with the emphasis there. So there's been an overlap in the Middle East between these two Neolithic cultural amoebae. One is more emphasis. The Kosh influence is more emphasized by Mesopotamian astrology. And indeed, I believe my reading of the Gilgamesh epic is that it is an astronomical story, a journey through the ecliptic, through the 12 signs of the zodiac, and the emphasis in Egypt on the Atlantis culture. Then the second generation of civilization, which Spengler now acknowledges beginning in the second millennium BC, from 2000 BC to 1200 BC, comes into being when these heroes come down from the north, the Turanians, i.e. the Indo-Europeans, Indo-Aryans, and the Zhou in China, come down and start invading with these weapons in a very aggressive way. We get the Hyksos coming in about 1700 BC and invading and taking over Egypt, or at least northern Egypt. We get the Dorians coming down in 1200 BC, completely overtaking and submerging the Mycenaeans. They bring cremation of the dead with them, which the Mycenaeans did not have. The Mycenaeans still had a very strong inheritance from the Atlantis temple building cultures with their tholoi tombs and their worship of the dead. There's an ancestor hero cult there that's different from the Turanian disdain for the afterlife with cremation that comes in. They enter into India as well. The Kassites come down and conquer Babylon. And indeed, the Kassites are a pretty culturalist dynasty. They last for about 500 years or so, from about 1500 BC down to maybe 300, 400, something like that. But it's a boring dynasty. It's the successor to the Babylonian, the first phase of the Babylonian civilization, which begins with Hammurabi the Great in 1790 BC. They take it over, and there are no great works of literature from the Kassites. Their art is just a stiff, stale repetition of copying Babylonian culture forms. The Kassites are pretty boring, but it's very clear that they are also descended or related to the Indo-Aryans. And then we get the Zhou settling and establishing with their warrior hero cult and its ethos China. So we get the second generation of civilization that comes in by the time the aggressive Turanians come in and establish this philosophically inclined generation. So that's Spengler's model, just to contrast with Steiner's a bit, because it's interesting that they both use the same terms, Turan and Atlantis, not Kosh for Steiner, and they both have similar ideas about the interactions between the Turanians in the north and then the Iranians. And then Steiner says there was a war between them, and he favors the date. There are actually three dates given for Zarathustra. There's the date that most scholars think from the time of Darius, 500 BC, which I don't think is correct. The Gathas date from 1000 BC. That's the other possible date. 1000 BC and the Gathas were supposed to have been written by Zarathustra, and the language of the Gathas is very similar to Sanskrit. So those two peoples cannot have been separate for very long. I think that's the actual date. But the Greeks had suggested that, and this is a traditional idea, it's not a bizarre Steinerism, that Zarathustra actually lived 5,000 years before the Trojan War, which puts him circa 6,000 BC, which is a date favored by Mary Settegast when she writes her book about Zarathustra called When Zarathustra Ruled, where she favors that date. She picks it up from Steiner and writes a wonderful book. Her Plato Prehistorian deals with the Atlantis myth, and When Zarathustra Ruled, which I highly recommend both of these books, deals with this idea. What if we put Zarathustra back 6,000 BC? Perhaps he was the founder of the later phase of the Neolithic, the pottery Neolithic, in which pottery gets up and running, agriculture enters into a major phase, human sacrifice is mostly done away with. It's an interesting hypothesis. So Spengler favors this idea that Zarathustra dates back to about 6,000 BC and establishes the religion of the Zoroastrianism, the second cultural epoch of his Post-Atlantean civilization, and then is at war with these Iranians, a war which they are victorious over, and Persia becomes settled and locked in place as the next civilization. So we get this idea of King Yamshid as the culture hero who invents architecture and agriculture, which are forms of technology that lock a people into place, plant-like, so that they can develop as a high civilization rooted to a locale. Whereas the amoeba cultures of Spengler in the north with the Turanians are moving. They're mobile. They're hot and mobile. They're constantly moving and morphing. So then we have this. So Steiner ends the chapter by saying that, so that's Zarathustra, and we have then Zarathustra deciding to incarnate within the Solomon boy, Jesus, to incarnate within Jesus of Nazareth, who has been descended directly from the line of Abraham. And it's very important that that be the case. And he sets this question up for the next lecture, which he will give the answer to for this. So this is why the three wise men have gone specifically from east to west. They are Persian. That's traditional. Again, that's not a weird Steinerism. That's traditional. So they must have been Zoroastrian, and perhaps they were looking for the reincarnation of their master Zarathustra, just like Tibetans looking for the reincarnation of their Lama, which is shown in that movie Little Buddha, where they're convinced that this boy has one of the components of the Lama that has their Lama that has died. Okay, so we'll pick up from there next time for Lecture 2 of Steiner's Gospel of Matthew.